marching home again. Hurrah, hurrah. We'll give them a hearty welcome then. Hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer, the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home.
Company! Halt! Present! Arms! Shoulder! Arms! Order! Arms! In place, rest! If you folks have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you. Thank you. Tents are open for your inspection, I hope. No contraband in there, is there? I hope not. Please do ask them questions. They don't bite too much anymore. Just don't leave your children unattended. Thank you for coming.
A little social history. The time is 1861. Those that came to see Minutemen is on the other side of the wall. Two civil wars, that one in the 18th century, this one in the 19th century. Why is there a Catholic priest in Concord? I play the role of Father Bernard Flood. He and his brother, both born in Ireland, have a parish in Waltham, St. Mary's. And Concord has become a mission church for the Catholic Church of St. Mary's. Father Bernard Flood is the second priest to come into Concord to minister to the number of Irish immigrants who have moved here. Why have they come to Concord? Because the railroad was being built through here. And at the time of the famine in Ireland, as immigrants came into Boston, they moved out to where the work was. So Father Flood, by 1854, is coming into Concord on a regular basis, ministering to the Irish immigrants here. There are close to 500 Irish, almost a fourth of Concord's population. If you know anything about the history of Concord, you'll know that it is a Puritan town, very anti-Catholic, anti-Papist, anti-anything, relics, whatever, that have to do with the Catholic Church. However, because of the number of Catholics that are now living here, there is the need for the ministry. Father Flood eventually will end up buying, through the Diocese of Boston, the Universalist Church in Concord and starting what is now St. Bernard's Church, which you can presently see in town. That's in 1863. 1865, the church will buy enough property to have a burial ground for the Irish soldiers that die in the Civil War. And by 1868, Concord will become its own parish. So this is the reason why Father Flood is out in the town. He's looking out for the interests of not only the immigrants and their families, he's performing marriages, he's saying Mass in town, although much to the chagrin of some of the people that live here. You will have the opportunity to speak to Henry David Thoreau, who will give you his take on the Irish. They're not overly liked here. They're living in squalor. While working on the railroad, they're paid 6 cents a day for a 16-hour day. The ideas, the philosophies of the Catholic Church and the Puritans that live here, the Congregationalists and the Transcendentalists, are at odds. And Father Flood confronts those situations and those philosophies, including the question of slavery. And he will point out to you that his concern is as much for the wage slave Irish as they are for the Negro brethren. The Catholic Church itself officially takes no stance on the Civil War, although individual parishes and priests pick sides, north or south, in the issue. Father Flood will be about and will be pleased to answer any questions that you have, and you can obtain the consenting or other side of the issues with Mr. Thoreau. Thank you, and enjoy 1861 in the Manse.
And if you want to hire me, step into Mickey Mars. Ask for Larry Doolin and his Irish jaunting cars. Some say all wars are over, and I hope to God they are. For you know full well they never were good for a new car. Peace and plenty may they reign here both near and far. Then we'll drive the peace and festival in the Irish jaunting car. And if you want to hire me, step into Mickey Mars. Ask for Larry Doolin and his Irish jaunting cars. They say they are unwanted men, the French and English too. But it's all about their commerce now, they don't know what to do. If they come to Ireland, our jolly sons to mar, I'll drive them to the devil in the Irish jaunting car. And if you want to hire me, step into Mickey Mars. Ask for Larry Doolin and his Irish jaunting car. And if you want to hire me, step into Mickey Mars. Ask for Larry Doolin and his Irish jaunting car.
Modified them. You can see they have a kind of a jury rig thing here that turned it into a percussion weapon. And they were around. Both sides needed weapons quite badly. I mean, these are Enfields. These are British made. Both sides went over and bought weapons, various kinds and supplies from England. But you'd go over there and there'd be the commissioner from Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, all trying to buy British arms. It was tough for England because they were trying to not get in trouble. They didn't want to piss off Washington, but they also looked and said, you know, you're cutting off our cotton supply for our industry. And they also looked and said, you know, we don't really particularly care for a strong America, considering what they did to us. So
Yeah, might as well be divided.
they were trying to hedge their bets. And, they liked the South because the South was basically, when you think of it, the South was buying their products and it was supplying them with the raw materials, which they always loved of us when we were a colony. The North was basically helping to put them, at least we were eating up their markets because we were becoming industrialized up here. We made the farm implements. We made, you know, the shoes and all the products. We were pretty much almost a self-sufficient nation then. I mean, we were still getting high technology. You were going to get a steam engine. You might get it from England, but you know, they were the 128 of their time because we stole technology from them.
Yep.
Including the start of the Industrial Revolution, Saugus and Lowell. Yeah. Enfield percussion rifle, about 400,000 were used on each side, both Confederate and Northern, as we couldn't produce enough arms for ourselves. This was a muzzle loading weapon, where you had to load these things through the muzzle. Good soldier would be able under fire to fire 3 times under fire, which was very difficult. You would first take a paper cartridge, and a real paper cartridge would be about 60 grains of gunpowder in the ball that you're going to shoot. You would tear off the top, pour the powder down, and at the last second, drop the bullet in. And it was a conical bullet you would drop in. You would then pull your ramrod and tamp it down like you've seen in many movies. You then bring the weapon up. And then unlike the guns that the men at Concord or Daniel Boone used, it wasn't a flintlock. The technology had developed to a percussion weapon, where a small little cap, like those little red and black ones you used as a child, would be put on here. You would then be at the ready. You would then be told to aim, where you'd pull this back, aim at your enemy, and then fire. The bullet would then come out, it would grab the rifling of the barrel and start to spin, which made it much more accurate. It also means that you could kill somebody at a much greater distance than in the past. And so they'd start engaging as early as 300 yards, but the fighting could start a lot farther away, which means that a lot more people could die by the time you actually collided with the other guy, which made the losses so much horrific in this war.
The North had a free population of about 24 million people when the war started. The South had a free population of about 7.25 million. So I mean, and that's important. Grant, it takes the U.S. Grant though to really take advantage of the population, the numbers. Basically, he starts to make it a war of attrition, which is nasty for the soldiers. Usually, up to that point, Union generals would fight a battle, win, lose, or draw, they'd retreat. So, I mean, you had a chance to live it. Like, if I had my choice, I'd fight with McClellan. I'd get to live. When they get to Grant, win, lose, or draw, Grant's going forward because he can replace the bodies and Lee can't, and he knows that. So he's always advancing. But for the men, I mean, it gets very depressing. They don't really have dog tags in these periods, like the dog tags the military has. Guys before battle would take pieces of paper and write their name and next of kin on it, and they'd pin it to the back of their uniforms before they went into battle. Now think about that psychologically. You're peeling a piece of paper on your back because you know you're going to die and be disfigured, and your relatives won't know who you are. I mean, that's pretty depressing. But they continued to go forward. And in the end, that war of attrition was one of the things that broke the South's back. Lee just could not replace his men. Lee lost them to desertion, death, disease, and he just couldn't replace it. At the end of the war, I mean, if he could put 12,000 guys in the field, he was happy, where he used to put 75,000 in the field. Sherman's march had a lot to do with that. Scholars today give that a lot of credit. When Sherman marched through Georgia and the Carolinas, women were left on the home front would write to their brothers and their husbands, and they would say, Sherman's coming, Sherman's on the way. It became like this great boogeyman. And so they'd write to these husbands and brothers who would then desert and go back home to protect their families. I mean, they've done a lot of studies. I mean, desertion was always a problem, but the desertion rates really peak when Sherman begins his march to the sea and then up to the Carolinas. So, I mean, it was a tough war.
Was that intentional on Sherman?
Yeah, well, they called it total war, which was sort of a new thing in warfare, relatively new thing. I mean, it happens in dribs and drabs throughout the period, but this was really a concerted effort to hit the Confederates every place they can simultaneously, because that way the Confederates couldn't shift troops around because they didn't have the population. Also, for the first time, the United States government actively targets civilians, which is a whole new concept. Up to that point, civilians were sacrosanct. Now, if you attacked a civilian, it was dishonorable. Now, it's not that they went out shooting civilians in Sherman's march. What they would do is attack the farms, and they would take all the food, they'd take everything.
Starve them.
Yeah, well, not just to starve the people, but those farms were supplying the army, the Confederate army. So Grant and Sherman in total war figured, well, if we starve them, they're going to surrender. So they start to attack civilians. So in a way, they want to make the war terrible. Sherman said he wants to make Georgia howl, because he wants it to be as horrible as it can be. That way it's going to be over. Because if you keep it genteel and we fight and we back up, we give you time to breathe, the thing was going on forever. And they hadn't advanced. By making it terrible and horrible, Grant and Sherman argued that it would end quicker. I don't know. I actually read historians that still argue that Grant was wrong, that he lost a lot of guys and he didn't gain as much territory, and it was all these other factors. People, I mean, that's the great thing about being a historian. I mean, we stay in business by just continuing to argue with each other 134 years after the fact. It keeps us busy.
How the military maneuvers changed from the time of the Revolution, and what you were doing on the field didn't look that different?
No, it didn't. It really wasn't that different. It didn't. The problem is the leadership of the army was still fighting Napoleonic War from the late 18th, early 19th century, which are these linear tactics, massed formations, and they did that because the old smoothbore muskets, which they used before, and they still used in this war, were very inaccurate. So you mass all your fire, everybody shoots at the same guy, and you hope to hit something. So the mythology of hiding behind trees, and I know this is Concord, the mythology of hiding behind trees and shooting at people, I mean, you're using inaccurate weapons. Beyond 50 yards, you'll be lucky to hit anything. That's why they masked their firepower.
In Lexington yesterday, they said something like 1 out of 300 shots might hit.
I've read, and I don't know how the guy came up with the figure, 10,000 rounds were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord that day. They got 275 hits with 10,000 rounds. That's not very good, you know? So, I mean, so the tactics were still reflecting those kinds of weaponry. But by the time we get to the Civil War, the weapons are much more accurate. So they're fighting with old tactics but new weapons. So as the guys are masked moving forward, they make great targets for accurate weapons, which is why the casualty counts rise significantly. They do start to sort of spread out a little more, sort of almost like our idea of like hiding behind trees. So they call it skirmish order. The biggest problem though is no radios. The best, I mean, to communicate with your troops today, they use radios. You don't need to see your guys to control your guys, command and control. Back then, you had to see them, or at the very least, they had to be able to hear your bugles and your drums to control them. Because if your guys go off in the woods, you have no idea where they are. So the tactics hadn't really changed that much, even though the weaponry had developed significantly beyond, much to their dismay.
But these were not rifles. You didn't describe
These
them
are
as
rifles.
Oh, they are rifles.
They are rifles. The muskets, all a musket means is you load it from the muzzle. That's all that means. There's smoothbore muskets and rifled muskets. In the Revolution, and still somewhat in the Civil War, the smoothbores were just a hollow tube fired a round ball. So when it comes out, the ball flattens the lead and it tumbles. It's very, very inaccurate. Like I said, beyond 50 yards or so. Rifles have grooves. These rifles, by this period, fired conical balls. They're called mini. We called them mini balls. The guy who invented it was a guy named Claude Minet. The Americans always butcher French, so we called it mini. So this ball had sort of like a concave base. As it fired, the lead would spread, catch the grooves, and spin. And like a football, you throw a spiral. It's supposed to be good in trained hands about 300 yards. Recent stuff I've read has it maybe 150 yards. But still, that's 3 times what a smoothbore is. So these fire rifled. They are very accurate and very deadly. But again, the whole idea of command and control, if you just send your guys off into the woods to fight like Indians, you have no idea where they are. So that whole idea of like Indian fight, I mean, it's a long way away. Certainly for Americans, at least in a grander scale. You know, just because you can't keep control of your guys. Even in the Spanish-American War, Battle of San Juan Hill, it was a frontal assault up a hill, and that's the 1890s when they're using machine guns and Krag rifles. You know, so, and some argue during the Civil War there were Europeans here studying, because this was a modern war, and they would take what they learned here and bring it back to Europe, and because you know, this is the latest and greatest. So they brought to Europe things like trenches, because we were using trenches at Petersburg. So the Europeans say, oh, this is really cool. You hide in a trench and you're protected, and then you assault from a trench. And they bring it back to Europe. And it becomes a very important part of the military tactics for European armies. And then we bring us to 1914. And they're still using, in effect, Petersburg tactics, except the Germans have Maxim machine guns. And you've got airplanes and poison gas. But they're still having these massed assaults into trenches, which leads to all those millions of casualties. So, I mean, the military usually fights at least one war behind. You know, in some ways, still doing that.
My name is Henry Burrow. I am a writer here in Concord. Of course, I've lived here all of my life.
Alice Longfellow. I've come from Cambridge for the weekend. I'm staying with the Hawthorns. I'm sure you've heard of my father.
I'm Horace Mann Jr. I came over to see the troops, which are so interesting.
Well, I am Carrie Pratt. I'm very excited because my brother just recently married Anna Alcott. It was a beautiful wedding.
And thankfully a short one.
My name is Raven Stearns. My father owns the Buckman Tavern, and I'm visiting for the week. I'm staying at the inn in town.
My name is Ariana Bartlett. I live around here. I am Rose Hawthorne, and I am the daughter of Nathaniel Hawthorne, his youngest daughter.
So, Mr. Thoreau, what is your opinion on the war?
Well, to tell you the truth, I do not understand the whole idea about trying to bring the southern states back into the Union. My opinion is if they want to leave the Union, good riddance, let them go. We are now a free nation without 10 million slaves or slaveholders, and I think that without the southern states, we are now a very progressive free nation. So good riddance. I do not understand why our so-called president is so keen on trying to bring them back into the Union.
Oh, so you are fine with the nation splitting into two separate nations?
Oh, yes. In fact, I think that it is quite the progressive revolution to have our union split apart. Our union has been founded on the Constitution, and the Constitution is an immoral and sinful document because it allows for slavery. So if we are going to have a union that supports bondage and supports 4 million Negro slaves, well then, as far as I'm concerned, if it is going to fall apart, good. I'm glad to see it fall apart.
So can you tell me about your works of writing and literature?
Well, my recent book is entitled Walden, or Life in the Woods. It was published 5 years ago. It is about when I was living at Walden Pond from 1845 until 1847. But the book has sold fairly well. When we published 2,000 editions, it has since sold out. In fact, both of my books are currently out of print. My first book was entitled A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. But it has also gone out of print as well. So currently I have no books in print. But Walden has been slightly successful. My first book did not sell very well at all. Have you read A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers?
I did not.
Well, very few people did as well. In fact, when we published 1,000 copies in 1849, about 4 years later, my publisher returned 706 unsold copies to my house. I had a personal library of almost 900 books, over 700 of which I wrote myself.
But this second book, Walden, has been much more of a success than your first book.
It has had some good reviews, and in fact, some people have even tried to get me to go as far west as Ohio to lecture on Walden. I have no desire to go that far west to lecture, although I recently returned from Minnesota. I went out there for my health. I suffer with my lungs from consumption, and so I went out west in order to hopefully find better air so that I could help recuperate my health.
Well, I hope you're feeling better.
Thank you, madam.
So, Lieutenant Ripley, will you please tell me about what army you're leading?
Well, I am a first lieutenant in Company B of the 29th Massachusetts, and I have marched my company here from our encampment on Spy Pond, and I wanted to inspire them by bringing them to the place where the Revolutionary War began. My mother lives here at the Manse, Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley, so I have strong ties to Concord, and so we've been very well received in this town. Not 10 days ago, we received news of the Army's defeat at the Battle of Bull Run, and we never expected that our Grand Army should be defeated by a pack of rebels, and so my men were very disheartened, so I thought to bring them out here to reinvigorate them to the cause. And so we have been encamped all weekend, and the people of Concord have been coming out to see us off. They've been very supportive, and we shall be breaking our encampment this afternoon, and then we will go back to Cambridge, and from there we shall take the train in a few days' time down to Virginia, and from there we are to be stationed at Fortress Monroe.
So do you feel that this encampment has been a great success in invigorating the troops?
Absolutely. We took them down to the North Bridge, the site of the North Bridge battle, just yesterday at noon, and Judge Brooks came and gave them a very rousing speech. And we actually signed up some new recruits as well, because we are under strength right as of right now. So it was a very successful, and I think they feel strongly about the cause that we are engaged in, and they're willing to do what it takes to suppress this rebellion and restore the Union. Of course, my men don't share my views. I'm very strongly in favor of abolishing slavery, and a lot of my men do not care for that. And they're here because of the Union. But why restore the Union and leave the cause of its dissolution in place? If we restore the Union and we do not free the slaves, then we will be back here doing the same thing again.
So your view is similar but not exactly the same on the war as Mr. Thoreau's, correct? He feels that the Union should be left cut in half, and you feel oppositely.
Well, Mr. Thoreau, we differ on this one point. We both agree that slavery is the root cause of the troubles of these times. and that slavery must be wiped clean. However, he is content to let the South go. I am not. The Union has always been our strength, and it has been, it keeps us together economically, and it also prevents other nations from coming and invading us, and because of that strength we are allowed to live free. I owe all my happiness and all the privileges that I've had in this life to the Union, and so that's why I'm willing to go and fight for it now. So that's where we differ. I will not let the South go, and neither will President Lincoln.
So in this battle, are you leaving any loved ones behind here?
Well, yes, indeed. Well, first of all, there's my mother, Sarah, and this war has been a terrible grief to her. She was tutoring Harvard students for many years, and some of those students now, they had come up from the South to get a Harvard education. They are now back down South wearing the other uniform, and so she's grief-stricken, and of course now I'm going. And she has told me time and time again that she is no Spartan mother, and this is very hard for her to bear. And then, of course, my wife, Harriet. Her and I have been married for about 7 years, and she will be staying here with my mother to keep her company, to keep each other company. It'll get rather lonely for my wife, Harriet, in Cambridge. Harriet has views similar to mine, and she, of course, does not want me to go, and she's very upset. However, she understands my views, and she understands that part of who I am is in the fact that I will go and preserve the Union, like the poem by Robert Lovelace, written a long time ago when the English were having a civil war, where he said, I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honor more. And so she understands that, and she's been very supportive, despite the fact that we are both very saddened. I don't think that history has ever recorded a parting sadder than ours.
So it's very difficult for your mother, who taught students from the South, and now she must see them on the other side fighting against her cause.
Exactly, and yes, she shudders to think that they are now the enemy, and it's very hard for her to bear, and that her son will be going down to fight against them, and so that her son and these other young men whom she was very fond of are now enemies. And, well, that's the troubles of these times, and this war is very personal. This is not a foreign enemy. In fact, we have not declared war on the South. This is a rebellion that we are going to suppress. If Congress were to declare war on the South, that would be to recognize that the Southern Confederacy exists. So we are handling this internally, if you will. This is a very domestic affair. And because of that, we have these heart-rending ironies.
Well, thank you very much, Lieutenant Ripley, for your time.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. And I would just like to know what are your views on the war?
Well, I think most of my politics is what I've learned from my husband. Of course, a woman involving herself in politics is not quite acceptable by the community just yet. But my husband truly feels that it is a war to free the slaves in the South, and to, of course, rejoin the South with the Union, but to correct the problems that have torn us asunder before we actually try to simply heal the wound. And his principles are truly honorable, and I feel that I must live up to them. So.
And how do you feel about his leaving?
Well, I don't think any wife is happy to have her husband go off and possibly die, but he is truly going to fight for a cause. And I think the honor that is in that decision cannot be questioned. And while I do not necessarily appreciate his leaving, he is more than my husband. He is my best friend, and I must support his decision.
So you are going to stay here in the North with his mother?
Yes, indeed. I have a room at the top of the house.
Mm-hmm. And so you can stay together to support each other in this sad time.
She is losing her son as well, so we will take care of each other. So she's a lovely woman.
Thank you very much.
Weird, because people come and they think that they're like things that you've never heard before, like, oh, we're from the future and we're going to take a digital picture of you, and you're like, oh, wow, I've never heard that before. Like, people think it's so clever if they pretend they're from the future, and you're like, oh, it's so tiring.
Wow.
When Johnny comes marching home.